let's go. I'm a moderator, and I'm very happy to be here to help these very smart people talk about AI. So I think we'll start with our guest of honor. Everyone, please introduce yourself and maybe a little bit of background as to why you're here for this panel. And being grabbed and pulled into the room doesn't work.
I'm Arkady Martine. I write science fiction and fantasy, mostly science fiction. And my latest novella has a strong AI who is a kind of haunted house. And I like thinking about non-human minds. So probably that doomed me to have to talk about ChatGPT for another hour.
Okay, I'm Connie Willis. I've been writing science fiction since the late Cretaceous. And I was trying to think if I'd written anything about AI specifically. I think it informs everybody's history of science fiction. And Jack wrote The Humanoids, which was a breakthrough book about AI, and of course classics like Moon is a Harsh Mistress and by Heinlein and other works. I was always fascinated by how would artificial intelligence work? So I think that's probably why I'm inspired.
You were going to do that. Or open because it's
No,
I'll shut the door.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
I'll take care of that.
I didn't mean you had to shut the door.
I'm sorry. Let me throw it. I'm an easily distracted. All right. I'm Reese Hogan. I'm an author. Just because I'm here. Anyway, sorry. Okay, I'm here because I had one book come out in 2019 that was like a diesel punk, like spy thriller, like World War II setting. But the reason I'm on this panel is because my next book, called My Heart is Human, is coming out in July. And it takes place in 2094 after all technology has been shut down due to a rising concern about what we're talking about here. And the main character gets a hold of an old robot, which uploads into his head, and he has to figure out how to keep it from taking over his body, how to prove his own life is worthwhile. So I kind of had to be on this panel.
Hi, my name is Tregillis. I'm the author of 7 novels. My most recent work was a trilogy about not couched in the language of AI and robots, but about clockwork automata in a kind of alternate history setting. The idea being that around 1675, the Dutch had married alchemy with clockmaking, and essentially made clockwork terminators. The trilogy is really about in this radically altered European history and Northern American history, what happens when these objects, which are the basis of all labor and all economics, and which have been deliberately framed as being inanimate, non-conscious beings, start to overcome the mechanical and magical restraints placed on them, so that they can start to express their own free will. And the radical sort of apocalyptic change to society that inevitably follows from that.
That's okay. So I think what we'll start with is when you're looking at a story and you're thinking about an AI, or if there is an AI in the story, do you look at it more as a beneficial setting or as a protagonistic setting where the AI is against the humans? Or both? Or either?
I think the most interesting stories are a little of both.
Yeah.
Because I think that it's presenting itself in our society that way. We've become to rely on it in many ways, but it's also become our own worst enemy. So I think that it's worth addressing both sides of that in good fiction stories.
I absolutely agree. Jack was one of the first people with the humanoids that did that. There had been killer robots and there had been benevolent robots. and he was the first person to figure out that the unintended consequences of the benevolent robots, which could turn out to be bad for humanity, but not bad in any way turned out to be killer robots way, but in a more ironic and layered way. And I think that was a breakthrough that then many other authors picked up on and went, oh yeah, we don't necessarily know whether it's good or bad.
So that's fascinating.
Yeah, right.
I think those are only two of the very large number of possible ways of talking about an artificial intelligence in fiction. There are certainly classic ways of talking about artificial intelligence in fiction. Okay, so we came up with robots who could think, or something that can think that isn't us. Is it going to be bad for us or good for us? I think that is like a very primal human question. But what I end up gravitating towards is more what happens when we interact with them. It's almost less systemic, I guess, but also what happens when the borders between this is definitely human, this is definitely not human, because we created that one, we didn't create that one, get harder to see. And your book sounds real interesting. I always like things in other people's heads. That's always a good one.
Yeah, I think it can be, I always imagine you can have these intelligences that have their own motivations and their own wants and desires that may be hard for us to understand. So I imagine you start putting these intelligences, color technology, right? You put it in ships, or you put it in bodies very unlike ours. Initially to suit our purposes, but then they start to evolve in their own way, and they develop, and in doing that, they develop their own needs and desires, and you may find that there are whole herds of intelligent quadrupedal machines that are walking around doing we don't know what. Or building
feral horse problem with that now.
or building works of art that we don't understand because it's a story that is incomprehensible. So in that way, I see it as like almost like a movie.
I think when we had, like Arkady said, they either or, bad or good in terms of humans. And we tend to think like in stories like Isaac Asimov's Bicentennial Man, as the robot gains more and more sentience, he gets more and more human, and then he wants to be a human, and he wants to have, the same rights and privileges as a human, which I think is a legitimate story. But then what if he's just not interested in that at all and he wants to do something else? I always think we do better if we think of AI stories as alien stories, or maybe as fairy stories, because I think like Shakespeare had it nailed with Midsummer Night's Dream, where the fairies, they're not us. They sort of seem to be like us, but they're not really us. And they have a totally different moral system, and they have a totally different value system, and they have all these different powers that we can't even imagine. They circle the earth in a single night. They carry on all kinds of intrigues that we're only sort of glimpsing and don't really understand. And I think as we get into a whole new generation of AI stories, maybe we would be better off looking at them as aliens, or looking at them as some other species that we can only kind of glimpse from afar. And there are points of understanding, and points where we never understand each other. People have always said to me, "What's your favorite alien encounter novel?" And I always say Passage to India by E.M. Forster, because it shows the limits of how much we could truly understand another culture. And I think that's going to be one of the major problems, is we're going to assume we can understand everything, and I'm not sure we will be able to understand everything.
Well, jumping off of that, I think I do like the idea of looking at it as like aliens or humans, because they are very much their own culture. But I think the interesting story lies in the fact that they are also our children.
Right.
We created them. Everything they've learned is supposedly from us. So they're building from that and building up, and that makes for an entirely different being than one that's just coming from another planet.
Right. And we don't understand our kids either, so
that is a
there you
good
go.
point.
The question of inheritance is one that shows up in fairy stories also, actually. Sometimes the fairy child is her child or not. And of course now I want to like, AI, whatever, alien stories or fairy stories, ooh, oh my God. But there is this sense of the question of inheritance and the question of when you make something, what is your responsibility to, which is also like the Odyssey question. It's a question about being a god, and a question about what you are allowed to do to something you create and what who decides not allowed, which I think makes me want to read the last few books because you're allowed to decide.
Okay, you guys are doing so well riffing on the first question. I'm going to put out a real world application right now and see where you guys would riff on that application. Just recently, Duran used an AI algorithm to basically set up its video for I don't remember the song, and my wife is trying to remember and can't remember, but they basically had the AI come up with all of the images that were used in their video.
Invisible.
The song is actually called Invisible.
Is this a new song too, or did they just make a new video song?
It's on their recent album.
Yeah.
Yeah, so with that as a basis, as a writer, where would you go with that kind of a starting place with an AI story?
I've been reading tons of stuff about how scared everybody is of chat GPT and stuff, and I'm just like, am I the only person who's not scared yet? Until they conquer irony, we have a huge advantage over them. And it's one thing, I'm sorry, forget the chess games, who cares? It's irony that humans do. And it's bizarre connections that humans do that I'm like, and I'm not saying that AI will not be able to make those bizarre connections and will not understand irony eventually. There are children after all, but we're nowhere close to this, not at all. And I'm like, so what's the big deal? I don't get how this is different than being able to beat you at a chess game. And like, for instance, when you're writing a story, they're like, well, look at what's going to happen to your stories. And I would just like to say that my editor at Asimov's, Sheila Williams, she has been getting a ton of chat GPT stories. You always know. Terrible. They are terrible. And she instantly recognizes them.
They do have a very distinct voice.
Yeah.
And actually, I find, to go back to your prompt, it's a neat prompt. Because what Duran did with this, and I didn't know about it till you said it, so maybe I'm wrong about like specifics here. They have used a fascinating tool to create a piece of art. The input is clearly the song they wrote, lyrics and music, and associations that what is functionally a large language model, even if it's generating images, can pull from that sound pattern and those words from the large bucket that is the internet, which is made out of people. So, neat tool. Maybe we'll do it myself. It would be interesting to see how that's reflected back. Like, what's the reflection in the internet of these terms I put together and made music out of? That's cool. As a writer, like someone trying to use that as the generation point for a story, I land in journalism. What a thing just occurred. This is neat. I don't know where the story is there. But I think I'm another one, Connie. I've got my doubts. None of this stuff thinks yet.
Right. So this is getting a little far field with the prompt, but ChatGPT terrifies me because what terrifies me isn't, it's the interface between ChatGPT and people's inability to think critically. So just a couple of, like 3 or 4 days ago, the Santa Fe Institute had one of its community lectures, largely about AI and ChatGPT and things like that. Moderated actually by a neighbor of mine, Chris Moore at the Santa Fe Institute. And he, in his opening remarks, this was streamed on YouTube, so you could find it. It's the most recent thing from the Santa Fe Institute. he did an experiment where he said, ChatGPT, can you tell me about the impact on the career of Professor Chris Moore himself after he attended the January 6th riots? Now, Chris, used to be on the city council in the Green Party, so he clearly, the politics are very different from that. But ChatGPT said, here you go. Here's a whole page about Chris Moore is a professor on the permanent faculty of the Santa Fe Institute, is a specialist in all these things, all correct. He was seen, storming the Capitol building on January 6th.
Not correct.
Not correct, he insists, he wasn't there. But ChatGPT said he was, and then it went on about, and then he was noticed in video of the event, and then there was an outcry at the Santa Fe Institute. The Santa Fe Institute there were calls for his removal. The Santa Fe Institute carried out an internal investigation. They have never done an internal investigation in great detail about, and then there was a vote. It was very controversial. He kept his job. It was very controversial. So all the background is correct. It all read very, very plausibly, if you don't know Chris. And then he said, well, that's very interesting. Can you give me some citations on this, some press citations? And it said, here you go. Here's a link to the Santa Fe New Mexican. It looked exactly like a link to something in the archive of the Santa Fe New Mexican. And you could even tell what the title of this fake news article was based on the link text.
Yeah.
Local professor faces backlash after participating, blah, blah, blah. And he clicked it. The link, of course, didn't exist and it didn't work. And he said, well, that link doesn't work. Can you give me something else? And ChatGPT said, you need to contact the Santa Fe New Mexican because they're not keeping their archives up to date. Right? Yeah. And he really had to emphasize that this was an experiment. It terrifies me that someone who is not willing to engage with that so critically would swallow it.
Right.
And then someone last night at Radio Strike, another writer, was telling us that she had seen where someone had done an experiment that said, give me a list of all these academics who have been accused of sexual harassment. And,
But this isn't an AI problem, this is a human problem.
but it's the interface between AI and humanity, right?
Another way to.
It's how do you use a tool
I guess.
responsibly and intelligently.
Mhm.
That's what terrifies me.
Right. And we've never been able to use tools responsibly and intelligently from the beginning with the bones, hitting with the bones in Space Odyssey.
And it's a tool that is actively lying to people.
Right.
Tools shouldn't do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's making things up.
Right.
If you don't have the context to be able to sift the truth from fiction,
Right.
it's a
Right. And I had read that people were looking up, checking on citations in academic articles, and they too were totally made up. They're just fiction.
Oh, yeah.
So, and anybody can, obviously, but that idea that it's likely, obviously regulation needs to be built in quickly to keep people from being able to destroy other people's careers, et cetera. Because you're like, this is a great tool. I can get rid of this
I've got
person in a
an axe
minute.
to grind.
Yeah, I have an axe to grind. I'm gonna get rid of them. Yeah, I mean, I think it's not that I'm not, I don't think it's the robots are taking over. That's the part I'm not afraid of. I
Yeah.
don't see this as robot revolution. Or AI.
What you're talking about, that is a real fear and one I share very much. But from the artistic perspective, most of the apocalypse is coming because ChatGPT that I encounter in my professional life, both as a writer and actually as a policy person, though I don't work in areas, I'm in policy, so there's a lot of controversy, but I don't work in IT or national security or places where this becomes an immediate concern right this second. Most of what I hear is artists or writers being like, oh, we are never going to be, no one is ever going to want writing by humans. And I think that's pretty wrong.
Yeah.
And I guess to sort of pull this back to like artificial intelligence, I think one of the reasons that it's so dangerous in the way that Ian's talking about, and also one of the reasons that it's not as dangerous as maybe some people are worried about in the creative world, is that ChatGPT is not an AI. It's not, there's no there, there's no like intentionality to
Which is why it can lie.
which is why, it's why everyone can lie. It's why it doesn't care that it lies,
Right,
it doesn't
right.
care about anything.
Right.
So,
Yeah, I think in terms of the creative writing, I'm just like, humans, what is it you like about a novel? It's the unique connections that the writer made between different things. They saw, gee whiz, they saw this amazing connection between the Titanic and what is going on in politics right now. Or they saw this connection, and some connections are obvious and some are really out there. And then you think, oh, that's right, there's a huge connection between this, and it's something that nobody else would have thought of, but you instantly recognize its validity. I think that is something that we're very far from in AI. You're looking, like maybe you don't.
Oh, no, I think I do agree.
But just the, uniqueness, when you look at what made, Tolkien chose to tell a story. And much of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings could be copied by ChatGPT easily. Lots of details about a fictional world, and you're going to be doing all this. You're going to draw from Nordic, sources, and you're going to draw from ancient ethic, and you're going to draw all these different things and fairy tales, and you're going to put them all together. The story, the essence of the story that Tolkien told, I think, would be to duplicate. And I think you can duplicate the craft, but not the sentiment behind it, and not what the story was about. And I think that it's more of there's no there. It's just no. You could rattle off, and just like a bad writer can rattle off pages and pages of description that sort of looks like a story, but really isn't when you get to the end of it and realize it's not. So I think that's the particular, and the reason I say that is because in science fiction, there's been something called the fix-up novel for years, and the anthology, the theme anthology for years. And with the theme anthology, you say, okay, aliens have landed. The aliens from War of the World have landed, and this was an actual anthology. And H.G. Wells had them land in New Jersey, but we're going to have them land in France. And we're going to have them land in Texas, and we're going to have them land in Amherst, Massachusetts. And what happens in each of those cases? And even though this is the absolute same source material, every one of the writers in that anthology came up with completely unique and different stories. The Texas one was real short. It was by Howard Baldwin, and they just shot the hell out of him. And that was the end of the aliens. It was great. It's called Night of the Cooters, and it's a story that I recommend that all of you read. It's a great story.
And it's
But
been made into a movie.
There were
Award-winning film.
an award-winning film, yes. And there were just endless possibilities from this material, but each of them took this source material and did something unique with it. And the unique part was the human part again. So, ChatGPT, I'm sure could generate a story with that background, but I'm not sure they could generate a story that you would be interested in reading. Maybe I'm wrong.
I do think it's worth mentioning that we're talking about like AIs mimicking the kind of craft we write. But with like all the other, like somebody who wants content written for their website or something can hire these robots to write, and they don't care if it's creative. So I think it will absolutely put lots of writers out of jobs in that respect.
Yeah, that's true.
So that
That
scares me a
is,
lot.
yeah, and that's very legit. But I that's writing as a skill set.
The skill set
It's
is
different than
harder
writing
to
as
mimic.
a creative thing.
Yeah, it
So
is.
the two things aren't the same. But I think I think I said this morning when we were briefly talking about this subject. There are times when I wish some of my coworkers would use ChatGPT because then it would be easier to figure out, to have them say what they mean.
Right.
Because they aren't good writers. They're not good at communicating what they want to say. And what they want to say is important. So here's a tool that could, but then we run into the problem that you're talking about.
Putting people out of jobs. It's like our robot at home that vacuums our floor. Now the kids can earn $5 for it.
But that's an ongoing technological problem. That's
That is
not
true.
going on since
Yeah,
the
that's
beginning
not
of
quite
technology.
the same.
That's what's gonna happen to the horse and buggy and the buggy book manufacturers if we get cars, and
Yeah.
what's gonna happen to the gas stations if we get electric cars, and what's gonna happen to the, that's an ongoing dilemma that has had losers and winners all the way through history. But it has to be dealt with, because you can't just throw vast segments of the population out of work without major problems.
Okay, I think at this point we'll open it up to questions. Okay.
Question. So my understanding of the way that artists, like the Duran Duran video, visual artists are concerned, and maybe like creative writers too, is not so much that the story doesn't work or the story doesn't have a human element. I think that's true. But you have copyright infringement.
Right.
And so it takes, again, back to the job thing, that AI can replace our ability to make a living. Because
Even by using art that looks like yours.
Yeah, and by using our art, by taking the things
Right.
that we create
Right.
and repackaging them in a way that possibly studios or something can get around. Like I know that WGA, the writers union, is striking right now, and one of the things they're striking about is you cannot create screenplays without a human involved. So don't use your AI to make your screenplays.
I told my agent to put it in any contracts that we sign in the future, that any art associated with the production of something that I write has to include a human in its production. And that human has to be an artist, not the rando you pulled off the street to put a prompt into the AI. And similarly, that all editorial work had to be done by a human. So yeah, I think the copyright issue is enormously significant, especially for visual artists, where it's easier. Well, we think we're bad at interpreting the written word. We really have no education in interpreting imagery.
Right.
Like we don't teach that. We make an attempt at teaching how to read. But we don't make any real attempts at teaching how to look at an image unless for some reason you took an art history class in college. That's a long time before you get any training, and that training may not be super relevant.
Right.
Like the one I took was about Renaissance art, and okay, I understand how you draw perspective now, but that doesn't help me interpret, like, is this art like this other art because it's made by the same artist? Or is it like this other art because of particular thematic elements? That's not easy to do. So, yeah.
And there's my actual question, because that was a comment. I want to know is like Reese. I know because I've read your story. My Heart is Human. And one of the things, and hopefully this doesn't give anything away, but one of the sort of thematic things is, can you teach AI to care? And someone mentioned, the thing with AI is it doesn't care. It doesn't care if it lies. It doesn't care if it gets rid of your job. And it's like, I just wondered, like from the panel, can we teach things like human emotions to AI? And clearly it's processing.
Yeah,
so I'm not literally.
You know that I thought about this intensely for my book.
Yes.
So, I mean, I can start with kind of my thoughts on that, which, yeah, one of the big things is, can you teach something analytical like that, human emotion, the ability to read others' suffering and care? I am inclined to believe that not, but I do also believe that AIs they're learning from the ground up, and I don't think it's impossible that could be learned by a being that evolves past where we put any parameters. I think it could happen. I don't think it's likely to, but I'm not going to say it's impossible. But I think it's way more likely that it will learn to imitate caring. And then that's very
And that
scary.
might be good enough.
Maybe that's what a lot of humans are doing. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's my answer.
Yeah, one of the hardest things to duplicate when you're trying to teach AI is preference. You know, they can learn the names of a million objects or millions of objects, but we had a 2-year-old in our lives who he really loved gumballs. And he could, as we were driving along the street, there could be a gumball machine in a window of a restaurant, across a divided highway. And there's thousands of buildings, and there's people, and there's trees, and there's cars, and it's gumball. And because he wanted that gumball, and so he could see it in any landscape. And they have had a terrible time teaching, because he, of course, picked what it was he wanted. And it was based on previous experience. He had a gumball, apparently, and really, really liked it. But how do you teach preference? And if you can't teach preference, that's a major part of human learning, is as the preferences that we have developed as we grow. And then the caring and compassion kind of comes out of that. What we want, what we don't get, what lessons we learn from not getting what we want, all those things are tied up. And so real simple to teach AI to vacuum the rug and not hit people's feet. Real hard to teach them to want a gumball more than
As
anything
opposed
else.
to something else.
As opposed to something else.
Without like just saying that, like, okay, so this AI is going to really want gumballs more than anything else.
Right.
And you can do that. You can give a large language model a preference, but they can't generate a preference internally. And I tried. I asked it a bunch of ways to attempt to generate a preference. And I ran into the edges of what its programming, or at least what I'm allowed to access of its programming. A lot of this is not a question that can be answered. It doesn't have I like it. It doesn't like anything.
Right.
Because it isn't there.
Right,
There's
right,
no
there's no
mind
there.
yet.
And I think it's partly that you don't have it. How many of the things that shape us come out of our bodies? The fact that we have these bodies, and we can feel, and these chemicals in our bodies, and consequently we can feel pleasure, we can feel pain, we learn certain lessons from feeling those things. If you don't have a body or something like a body to experience, like she says, there's no there. So how do you get that? Because that's where almost all of our lessons come from, the dopamine hits and the pain that we're trying to avoid. Yeah.
That's a field of research. I know. I mean, I don't know the answer to the question, but that is a field of research. Or there are people who think about, do these things have to have an analog emotion in them so they're capable of empathy? So that, do they have to be able to feel pain so that they're able to experience empathy, so that they're able to care about them? I know there are people who think about this, but how do you do that? You mentioned, I think you mentioned maybe it's enough if it looks like they care, right? And I immediately thought, yeah, but that's what a sociopath does.
Yeah.
Right? That's what a sociopath, like you mimic empathy. That's scary.
So AI is sociopathic.
I think it could be,
But they still have no volition yet, so they're not anything.
Yeah, right.
And I'm not sure that we ever get to yet with the current thing that we're calling AI.
Right.
Like that's where my skepticism really lies,
Mhm.
is I don't think that a large language model is going to get us to what a science fictional definition of artificial intelligence would be, which is
General.
a general intelligence. I don't think we get there from here.
Mhm.
I think we get a whole lot of interesting stuff and a whole lot of scary stuff, but it's not that thing.
Mhm.
And I think it would have to be approached from a completely different point of view almost. I don't know how you get towards general intelligence from a coding perspective. I'm not sure that it is possible at all. Because again, how do you, and what's the point of having this thing? Like, is the point to be little gods and make children minds? That could be a point. Again, I'm not saying that is not a point. Or is the goal to create an infinitely expandable chatbot that gives you every answer you could possibly want? I think we'll make it there. But
If we can figure out a way to keep it from lying to us.
well, no, everything they could possibly want. You want it to lie. We are the ones who are making it lie.
Right.
We ask for that lie.
I want to lie myself.
Janelle, there's a.
Can I ask?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say there was a question in the back first, but Or maybe not. Patrice?
Kind of have one. And maybe this isn't the right way to talk about it, but aside from Skynet, what would be the first sign that there is a general intelligence somewhere?
Well, don't ask ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Not planning on
I know
it.
there's academic citations as well.
Right, right.
I mean, this is kind of flipped, but I long before ChatGPT, and I jokingly told people that I always thought the real advance in AI is going to come in the arms race between like spam bots and spam filters, right? Like the semantic filtering that you have to do, like you watch it through the early '90s up to now, and I lived in dread of the day when my spam filters can give up because ChatGPT or its successor is going to help strip them. So, I mean, I'm being a little bit flip, but I think there will come a time when it becomes, without focused study, it'll be get harder and harder and harder. Not necessarily in like story structure, right? We're talking about the deep craft, and I'm going to have a leitmotif that I'm going to run through this book symbolically. I don't think that's coming anytime soon, but
If they blow us all up, it won't matter.
I think the answer is we won't know.
yeah.
We're gonna look back and see.
Maybe only 1% or 2 or 3 people will know.
But also, at the beginning of any technology, everything seems possible. At the very beginning, when you're in the early stages of technology, so the early stages of CGI, everything seemed possible, and there were huge developments that were coming at just record pace. And you went from a very clumsy Photoshopped Fred Astaire dancing with a vacuum cleaner, and suddenly to Star Wars, and then Star Wars looking clunky compared to later Marvel movies, etc. And it seemed like anything was possible. Technologies always seem like everything is possible at the beginning. Then as they go, the unintended consequences also begin to close in the possibilities. And you realize, oh, I thought everything was possible, but it's only because I was at the very beginning of that technology. And so I'm hopeful that will happen, that we will think, oh my God, they can do this and this and this and this and this, and there's no end. There's always an end. There's always an end in sight. And there's always things that they can't do, but you never notice those at the beginning of the technology as it starts to expand.
There's a researcher, writer named Janelle Shane, who, this is, I think, sort of right before these large language models kind of broke out, but she has a really hilarious Twitter feed, and she wrote this book called You Look Like a Thing and I Love You, where she does these very funny experiments where she take these models, like these neural nets, and train them, find a training data set, and see what spits out. So the title of the book comes from, she fed it, I don't know how many thousands of bad pickup lines. That like she put out a call to her followers, like what are lines that people used on in bars to try to pick you up? And then she trained it on this, and the best thing it could come up with was, you look like a thing, and I love you. I say to my wife all the time. But her, I mean, and it's just, it's definitely worth reading the book and reading her Twitter feed. Some of them are, like she trained it on like the cereals, like.
And the dessert, I made one.
The AI desserts.
The AI desserts, I made one. I made a cranberry yas. I wanted to figure out how I would make. I have got a little picture, and it just says cranberry yas. It looks like a pie. But it really has to somehow say yas. So how do I do this? It involved writing on the crust of the pie, yas, and cranberry. But
her point, right, is that the thing she was coming back to is, if AI kills us all, it's not going to kill us all because it's so smart.
Right.
It's going to kill us because it's dumb, and people are putting these really dumb things in different systems.
Right.
It's funny if it can't, tell you how to bake a pie. It's not so funny if it's deciding, if it's running the autopilot on your 747. That's,
But this is totally off topic, but one night at a convention, we were all discussing pickup lines. And the guys were saying, the idea of what women think is a good pickup line and what guys think women think is a good pickup line is like, oh my God, miles apart. And so this one guy, after much discussion of various pickup lines, this one guy said, well, I always like to ask women what sign they are, which brought about all kinds of hilarity. But then we decided that the best one was from Gardner Dozois, who said, oh, come on, how bad could it be? How long could it take? The women all voted that the winning. And it was like, and then it was like, okay, so is the pity factor the thing that kept humanity going all along here?
It's the brutal honesty.
It is, that's brutal honesty. I'm sorry, that was a total, but it's better than you're a thing and I love you. You're a thing and I love you.
There's a human spark.
There's a human spark to it that there's not with yours, so yeah.
Except when, I mean, you said it now, you say it to your wife all the time, and I mean, my wife and I have very similar, like, nonsense phrases that are only meaningful because they were a bad idea when we saw them in the wild, but they were a good idea because we reinterpret them as hilarious to each other. And that kind of work at making nonsense meaningful is one of the things that our current large language models can't really do. You know, can't create that reinterpretation of connotation on top of what you can find by doing the world's best Google search functionally.
Right.
So, and connotation is variable. Like, I say something and it has years of meaning behind it, but if the next guy over says something that may mean something completely different, might be inverse or opposite, or just, I saw this really weird thing on the internet today. So,
Yeah.
humans are very strange. We have not yet made anything as strange as us.
Which is probably a good thing.
Yeah.
I believe we'll go with the question from Reese.
He has a question.
In the short term, AI can cause problems because, like, say it takes control of the autopilot on your airplane and causes a crash. But most of AI is constrained to it's on a chip, it's running something, and if it's going to take really any actions, it needs some sort of controllers to then actuate it and take an effect beyond just do a thing. So far, all of the fixes, repairs, adding ons, anything like that are still done almost entirely by humans. So is the risk of AI purely a short-term thing if suddenly they cause a bunch of problems, but then once they've done that, well, we know, okay, stop them. It's easy to stop them because they don't have the next stage of, like, building their bodies back. Like humans, if you don't get certain foods, you run out of certain amino acids, you die, even if you're eating other stuff. All of the AI is basically robotics that needs those other parts coming in to rebuild and to stay working. Is there that risk long term, or is it really just a short term? They go chaotic and then we're done with it. Okay, we've learned our lesson now. Move on to something better with more safeguards.
In a sense, a large language model isn't alive unless you're talking to it right now. And even then, I've got my doubts. But it's definitely not alive if no one's using it.
I mean, right
It's still a
now,
decision program.
right now, all AI and robots and such do need human manual programming and updates and stuff like that. The danger comes when you don't need it anymore. We're not at that point yet, as far as I know.
You need electricity.
But yeah, I mean,
But other than
well,
that, they don't need bodies.
I mean, the easy answer is no. I mean, we do need humans to put input and all that.
And I think one of the worst aspects is if, a lot of times people, usually like the chat GPT, everybody's looking at the negative possibilities, I think, which I think is good. I'm all in favor of that. But so often when you get something, we're all gonna live forever. We're gonna have nanorobots that clean out our systems and we're all gonna be young, we're all gonna be 30 forever, it's gonna be great. And I always am like, no, there's gonna be unintended consequences. Well, no, not with this. Like, there have been unintended consequences with everything since the beginning of time. So there are going to be unintended consequences with this. And it seems like there's a certain breed of futurists who just somehow believe that laws will be suspended and we will have no unintended consequences at all. Now, so I think that's one reason I haven't been worried about ChatGPT and AI and stuff, because people are very quick to figure out that this could be dangerous and all what the dangers are. And I'm sure we haven't got all the dangers figured out, and I'm sure there will still be unintended consequences we're not figuring out, but at least we're thinking about it. The things that really worry me are the things that everybody just embraces as, what a cool idea, let's do this. And you're just like, oh no, oh dear, let's hang on. There's gonna be something somewhere that's gonna come back and bite you.
Juice cleanses. That one, that's exactly that. Really? Have we thought about that for half a second?
Right, right. Well, today I just read that raw water, remember raw milk, where all the health people were drinking raw milk?
Raw
and then
water? Like
raw water. Raw water is like from springs supposedly, or from really crystal clear creeks. And all these people have come down, guess what? Bacterial diarrhea. Because there is no such thing as a clean well or a clean spring or a clean river. Yes, we do.
We have the environmental protection divisions for reasons.
That is correct.
Yes, Walter.
Well, I just had a thought on ChatGPT and its menace to the writing world. And I don't think any of the writers on the panel should be threatened by ChatGPT or me. But if you are, and this is a shorthand category, but if you are, for example, a Kindle Unlimited writer, okay, and Kindle Unlimited stories are very, very genre. Okay, there are very many categories of romance, action, mystery, and so on. And the people who make a success out of this kind of writing have to write like 12, 14, 15 books a year. Okay, so they're just little fiction factories, which means that they're very formulaic, because that's the only way you can do 15 books in a year. Right? But if you train the AI on that formula, I imagine you can produce a book every week instead of a book every month, right? And so you'll just start filling up this category with your stuff. I mean, what you get isn't perfect. You know, you'd have to do some rewriting, you'd have to do some editing, you'd have to fill in the illusions, you'd have to do some other stuff, you know. But what I think you could get an acceptable mediocre genre novel. And if that's all you're after, if that's all you can write in the first place.
I think that that there is a market for the acceptable mediocre genre novel.
Right,
And
especially if
that's
it's free, which can
not exactly a bad thing.
Yeah. No, what I
But
found is
I think what might happen, and this is me being a speculative fiction writer, and speculating, is you're gonna oversaturate that market really fast. Because there aren't enough readers
Yes.
for as much content.
That's it. That's why
as
the
ChatGPT
very
can.
first adaptees are going to end up filling up the entire ecosystem.
If there's an ecosystem for NFTs at all.
So,
We can talk about that.
I haven't read it.
Well, there's two things. One is, I find it interesting because I think as science fiction readers and writers, we think of AI as when they're independent, and of course, right now they're calling GPT AI, and it's like, not really.
Yeah.
For us. But the second thing is, this is for being clockmaker's live. Thank you. And I think that's the thing with, I think in science fiction, we talk about the threats, and you guys have to a lot, but the question, of course, is if AI becomes really sentient, are we enough of a threat that it does like Skynet and the Terminator films, just says, let's get rid of those organic things? Or in Ian's talk workbooks, they are basically slaves to humans, and so they want independence.
There's an option where an artificial intelligence would not care.
Yeah.
And that's the one I find most likely. I think if we actually ever managed to make something that was truly an independent mind that was artificially generated, it would not be human. It would not be human at all. And I don't see a Skynet ending really. I see kind of a total abandonment and an interest in something else.
The one I always look to is like Star Wars. That's just people living in harmony with other AIs and then just treating them as part of society and they all have their own personalities. So that's kind of the best example I've seen of like when that's not are they good or bad, they just exist among us.
Yeah, I keep thinking of like the go to enormous effort and expense to create the greatest artificial intelligence, and it's only interested in mycology.
Yeah.
God may have done that.
Bring more fun.
Right. Or it just wants to make the best paper clip, you know, whatever.
We just hope they're not, that we don't become an annoyance, that they're interested in something else altogether, but then we become somehow an annoyance. I always think of Raccoon Sheldon's screw fly solution, which is not, that's aliens and not AI. Where, you know, we're the equivalent of a malaria mosquito and the aliens are just, they don't have anything against us, you know, they're not coming to Earth to try and invade Earth and kill us all because we're the enemy. We're the malaria mosquito and they need to get rid of that so that it's a habitable planet. And so they figured out a way to do that. And that's a really terrifying story, not just because it's a story about the end of humanity, it's a story about the end of humanity because we're not even important. We're just a minor inconvenience. So I could see an AI where that was, you know, they wouldn't be malicious toward us and they would have just their own world that they created and their own interests, but somehow we became, for some reason, an annoyance to them and need to be brushed off. And that's kind of what I'm too. I'd much rather think that they thought of us as the enemy.
Because at least it's happy.
Right, exactly.
It's like that pirate story. But you have heard of me.
Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Do we have any more questions from the audience?
Given up.
We petered out. Okay, so at this point, since several of you are very learned about science fiction, what are some of the science fiction stories where you really liked how AI was approached, and maybe ones that you didn't like how it was approached? And I'll let you pick what.
Okay, I would like to say, if you've never read any Gordon Dixon stories, they're wonderful. He wrote a series of stories about all the unintended consequences of having sentient robots. And one of his most famous is called the Law Wagon, which is a portable machine which will arrest you, incarcerate you, try you, and execute you, all in one fell swoop. And, which is very efficient and really cool, except if they get it wrong somehow, something goes wrong. And then he has another, I can't remember the name of the story, but it's about a sentient house where the house becomes very resentful because the husband is not paying enough attention to the wife and wishes to replace the husband. And he begins to do things that will get rid of this annoyance and make it so he and the woman can be happily ever after living in this house, which is him. So anyway, he always put, and he was writing those stories in the 1960s and 70s at a time when everybody was kind of in love with AI, in love with all the positives that robotics could bring to our lives. And he was just hilariously pointing out all of the complications and problems. So.
I never know what kind of I really like when to talk about anyway. So give me a little bit more.
Charlie Strauss has I think it's a novel called Accelerometer. I find a lot of like the kind of singularity-ish stuff very, to me, reads very dystopian. So often I don't get into it, but Charlie Strauss is the kind of writer who has a million ideas and some of them always hit with me. And so he I remember there's a bit in Acceleron, which is germane to what we've been talking about. So if you imagine, ChatGPT Generation 9, and if you imagine, if you think today about, say, organized crime networks that hide their money in offshore accounts, right? And the idea of having holding companies, right? Well, what if you just had an AI that could continuously file legal paperwork to incorporate and then spin up, show and incorporate that and incorporate that and incorporate that.
We have that already.
And then I think we're
Someone tried to do that.
this kind of arms, and he pictures this arms race then. So then you have the AI that's like deconstructing this network of holding companies. I find that very plausible. I really do.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
My favorite AI stories are all like strong AI. They're all AI who are people. I think probably my favorite one is Tyson Cohen from Spin State by Chris Mary, which is just one of my favorite characters at all. This AI is a conglomeration of a lot of smaller systems that achieve sufficient complexity to become conscious, and has made some programming to make that impossible to change. Just the character is fantastic. But that book is interested in what kinds of minds are human, not what would happen to our current society with artificial intelligence. So, which is more of the kind of AI book I like to read and write. So that's a personal.
Say the title and not.
Spin State by Chris Meredith, which is definitely a pseudonym. Very good one.
I'll talk about this author I've discovered in the last couple of years, Al Hess, because he's a new Angry Robot author. And he actually, I wrote my book before I discovered him, but he probably wrote the best prompt title to mine. It's called Nazarene Blues, and it's also like an AI in the head. But his ends up falling in love with the character and becoming a problem in that way. And I really like the weird relationship things, so I really connected with that one. And he just came out with a new one called World Running Down that I haven't read yet. That's going to be next on my list. He writes a lot about AI and kind of the weird relationships between them and people. Al Hess.
How do you spell the last name?
H-E-S-S.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we've got about 5 minutes before we should wrap up.
Okay.
Unless, okay, I see another question.
Another thing that came up in my mind is we're generally talking about AI in this context as to the point of approaching or imitating humans. But a lot of what it's currently used for is things like training out enough models, and now when you send something down the assembly line, it doesn't have to be perfectly oriented. It can just be spinning slightly off kilter and the system can handle it. Is there a line where you draw between like, it's designed to do a task, but it's not like directly coded, it's always gonna be right here. It's like, it's gonna be right here, figure the rest of it out, and it can do that. Is that still AI in your eyes, or is that just a well or differently coded program with instructions? And given that everything we're designing AI for is usually to help us do things where we don't want them to be off task. Humans become off task. Are we ever even going to try to design true AI? Because there's no purpose if you have a robot that's supposed to work on the assembly line and then it just stops doing it because it's like, I want a grease brake. So like,
I think Asimov wrote a lot of these, and they're really
Right.
fun to read.
Yeah.
I want to rephrase the question. What is an artificial intelligence made by an alien like? So I think it's the same question.
so one
What-
that
what's-
doesn't have a
are we
human
making-
origin.
Any human origin, what would that be like? Is that still, how do we know that's an artificial intelligence?
It's back to the singularity, right?
Yeah.
This whole idea of like, it bootstraps itself,
Yeah.
where you don't understand what it's doing. And,
At what point does AI begin to generate emotions like we do? The fear, the affection,
Or would it?
the envy, the resentment. When does that begin in this process?
Or is it just the chest waiting factor?
Yeah.
Right? Like pain is an aversion to damage. It's the same as like equating the king as really high in chess for the scoring system that tells you how to play.
But is pain just an aversion to damage? Is that all it
It's
does?
the origins.
Yes, but is that all it does?
Yeah, I think human emotions are pretty unlikely to actually occur organically in AI. Like you maybe you'll learn to do it at chess, but it's not gonna feel jealous. It's just gonna be ready to play another game. So, I don't know.
Right, it's not gonna
Anyway.
roll the pieces. Yeah,
Unless we told it to do.
unless we
something.
told it to do
Still
that.
not thinking.
Still not thinking, just following commands, exactly.
Are we just following commands?
I mean,
You're getting awfully philosophical.
this is an awfully philosophical topic.
It is.
There is an argument for that. There's an argument that we are completely conditioned.
Yeah.
And it's one that there's a lot of counter arguments to, which are more or less believable. For me, because we cannot reproduce conditions exactly, it's very hard to prove, almost beside the point, to prove that humans are entirely programmatic in their styles. Because what does that actually change? If so, what? If not, what?
Well, and you know, the new, we went from AI where you have to code it all to AI where it can learn from its mistakes and it continue to learn. And that's kind of where we are now with the new learning AIs. But people learn, and that's kind of how they learn from their mistakes. But humans do not always learn the correct lesson from what happened. Like Mark Twain always said, a cat will only sit on a hot stove once, but it will never sit on a cold stove again. So it's learning the wrong lesson. Don't sit on the stove. And who is to say that if you have this built-in, learning ability, if that's not one of the unintended consequences and what unintended side effects is that they will learn a lesson, but it may not be the right lesson. It
It's
will
like
be
the
a
cat
lesson.
identification based on the background, not the cat.
Right. And so what do we do with that?
That reminds me, because I watched this like John Oliver special on AI, and it's something called the black box thing, where you put in input, it does something and it pops it out, and it's not always what you expect, but you don't know what happened in there. And the example he used was they were trying to teach an AI to identify cancer. I don't know if any of you guys have seen this episode, if not, you know the story, but they were trying to teach it to identify cancer, and they fed lots of pictures of skin, some with cancer, some without, to try to teach it. And it came up with the conclusion, rulers are evil, because the pictures of cancer have rulers in them oftentimes.
Oh.
So they know how that one happens, but they don't always know what happens in that black box. And that's kind of where it gets scary, because it's like, how did it come to this conclusion?
Okay, we've got about 5 minutes till the next panel, so let's thank our authors for.
Yeah, that time.